In the rolling hills of Henry County, Virginia, where endless tobacco fields swayed like green oceans under the burning sun, stood Mill Haven Estate. To outsiders, the Caldwell family were perfection. Wealthy. Refined. Respected. The kind of people whose Sunday church seats were always in the front row. But behind those polished walls, a secret festered. A secret so dark, when it finally came out in the freezing winter of 1789, it didn't just scandalize the neighborhood, it sent shockwaves through the entire aristocratic society of Virginia. Court records, hidden for more than 200 years, tell the story of forged wills, calculated deception, and a young woman whose entire childhood was nothing but a carefully engineered lie, all leading to a purpose so sinister, you won't believe it was real. When the truth emerged, 23 witnesses took the stand, spilling secrets so horrifying that 3 judges quit the case on the spot, declaring they had no moral strength to continue. The authorities tried to bury the evidence. The church denied it ever happened. And the surviving Caldwell family? Gone. Vanished from Virginia forever. But no matter how deep you bury the truth, it eventually claws its way back to the surface. This is the forbidden story of Elizabeth Hartwell and the Caldwell family's unholy bond, a scandal so chilling it was locked away in a courthouse basement until 1892, when a clerk stumbled across it by accident. His official report described the contents as too disturbing for public consumption. The files were sealed again for another 50 years. To uncover the Caldwell family's secret, we have to rewind to the autumn of 1776, a Virginia still in chaos from the Revolution, struggling with freedom, and home to an estate where the promise of independence came with a horrifying cost. Sprawling over nearly 3,000 acres of prime tobacco land, Mill Haven wasn't just a plantation, it was a fortress of wealth, power, and secrets. The Caldwell family had ruled this land for 3 generations, ever since Governor Alexander Spotswood himself signed the original land grant in 1722. From that moment, they were part of Virginia's untouchable elite, and they intended to keep it that way at all costs. The patriarch, Jonathan Caldwell, was a man people didn't just listen to, they obeyed. Before the Revolution, he sat in the Virginia House of Burgesses. He controlled tobacco shipments that stretched from Richmond to London. And after tragedy struck, when his wife, Catherine, died in childbirth just months before the Declaration of Independence, his power only grew. Jonathan was 42, towering over 6 feet, with dark hair streaked with silver and eyes like frozen steel. His late wife? A Harrison, one of the first families of Virginia, descended from the Jamestown settlers. That marriage had been more than romance, it was a calculated alliance, fusing 2 of the richest tobacco fortunes in the Commonwealth into an empire. But then came the Revolutionary War, and with it, chaos. Trade collapsed. Currency became worthless. Plantations crumbled into debt. Most men in Jonathan's position clung to the crown. Not him. Jonathan Caldwell didn't fight for freedom out of passion, he fought for opportunity. He saw what others didn't: independence meant new laws, new courts, and new ways to seize power. And he moved fast. While others scrambled, Jonathan secured French trade through Philadelphia contacts. He demanded gold and land deeds when everyone else took worthless paper money. One by one, rival estates collapsed. But Mill Haven? It didn't just survive. It expanded. And with every acre he gained, so did his hunger to control more than just land. Mill Haven didn't just survive the war, it exploded in size, swallowing up neighboring estates at bargain prices while other families went bankrupt. But for Jonathan Caldwell, wealth brought a dangerous problem. He had no male heir. Without one, Mill Haven could be torn apart and scattered among distant cousins, a fate his grandfather had warned against decades earlier in letters still locked in the family strongbox. The old patriarch's words were chilling: a fortune divided is a fortune destroyed. See that the Caldwell name and Caldwell lands remain forever united, no matter what sacrifices this unity may require. That warning became Jonathan's obsession. He considered remarrying, and the offers came in from some of Virginia's most powerful families. But Jonathan wasn't looking for love. He wasn't even looking for a wife. The thought of sharing his power with another strong-willed woman like Catherine made his stomach turn. He had grown addicted to absolute control. And worse, any woman from another family would bring her own loyalties, her own politics, and her own ambitions. That was unacceptable. Jonathan didn't want a partner. He wanted a tool, someone who would exist entirely for his vision, someone whose very survival depended on him, someone bound to him by a tie far stronger than marriage. And then, fate delivered. It was November. Rain hammered against the tall windows of Millhaven's great house, the storm building in a way that felt almost deliberate. In his walnut-paneled study, Jonathan sat alone, reviewing shipping manifests in the flicker of 3 silver candelabras, relics from Catherine's dowry. The room was a perfect reflection of its master, every book aligned with military precision, every document filed with ruthless order, every surface polished to a cold, mirror sheen. Servants knew, with Jonathan, perfection wasn't optional. And outside, the storm that would change everything was closing in. Before Jonathan Caldwell lay a vision of near-total victory. The tobacco harvest had shattered expectations. The new French trade contracts were making him richer than even he had dared to imagine. His Richmond reel. Estate investments were exploding in value. Jonathan Caldwell wasn't just wealthy, he was becoming one of the most powerful men in Virginia. But in the middle of all this success, one thought gnawed at him like a hidden rot: what good is all this wealth, if it can't be preserved? It was nearly midnight when the silence broke. In the doorway stood Samuel Bigham, lean, weather-beaten, and as loyal as they come. He had served the Caldwell family for over 2 decades, carrying out orders that were not always fit for polite society. "Master Caldwell," he said, voice heavy, almost hesitant. "There's been an accident. Richmond Road. A carriage overturned in the storm." "Quality folk, sir." Jonathan set down his quill. In his world, quality folk meant status, connections, and sometimes opportunity. "How far?" 2 miles. "Near Devil's Elbow, the sharp bend by the creek." "The driver's dead." "So are the gentleman and lady." "Thrown clear when the carriage rolled." "The horses bolted, but we recovered the baggage." Jonathan's mind ticked. Death was tragedy to most, but to him, it could be a doorway. "Survivors?" Bigham's eyes narrowed slightly. "1. A girl. 10 or 11, maybe. Thrown into the bushes, probably what saved her life. Keeps asking for an Uncle Thomas. She's in shock. Doesn't remember much else." And there it was. An orphan child from a quality family. To Jonathan, that wasn't just news. It was a possibility. What about identification? Bigham's face shifted into that guarded expression Jonathan knew well, the kind that meant the details were better left unspoken. "Found documents in the gentleman's coat. Name appears to be William Hartwell." William Hartwell. His wife Margaret. Their daughter. And with them, a fortune in gold, payment for land they were about to buy in Kentucky. The second Bigham mentioned gold, Jonathan's interest sharpened like a blade. But it wasn't just the money. It was the way his overseer spoke, carefully, deliberately, as if there were details too dangerous to say aloud. "Bring the child here," Jonathan ordered coldly. "Feed her. Dress her. And Samuel," he paused, locking eyes with his overseer, their unspoken understanding filling the silence. "We'll discuss the rest, in private." An hour later, Jonathan entered the guest room. What he saw there would stay with him forever. On the edge of his grandmother's 4-poster bed sat the girl. Dressed now in a borrowed nightgown, warmed by the fire where her ruined clothes were drying. Despite her ordeal, she didn't look like a lost, broken child. She looked composed, refined. Her manners gave her away, the delicate way she folded her hands in her lap, the careful, educated tone when she thanked Martha for the milk. But then Jonathan saw her face. And his blood ran cold. She looked like Catherine. The resemblance to his late wife was uncanny, the same delicate jawline, the same rich chestnut hair, the same piercing dark eyes. When those eyes rose to meet his, Jonathan actually gasped. For the first time in years, something shook his composure. "What is your name, child?" he asked, voice lower than usual, almost gentle. He sat across from her, deliberately meeting her gaze at eye level. "Elizabeth Hartwell," she whispered. Her accent was polished, educated, unmistakably a child of high breeding. Then her voice cracked, trembling with the one question Jonathan had no intention of answering truthfully. "My parents, are they truly gone? Samuel said there was an accident, but I thought, perhaps." The words hung in the air like smoke from the dying fire. Jonathan studied her, not just her resemblance to Catherine, but the spark in her eyes. This was no farm orphan who could be hidden away and forgotten. This girl carried intelligence, refinement, and bloodline. If she disappeared, people would search. Questions would be asked. And that made her both a risk and an opportunity. But she was also completely alone, frightened, and utterly dependent on his charity for survival. "I'm afraid so, my dear," Jonathan said softly, reaching out to pat her hand in what appeared to be a gesture of paternal comfort. "But you're safe now. Tomorrow, we'll make inquiries about this Uncle Thomas you mentioned. We'll find your family and see that you're properly cared for." Even as he spoke these comforting words, Jonathan's mind was already working through possibilities that would have horrified a less calculating man. Here was a child of obvious quality, orphaned and alone, with family connections that were apparently distant and difficult to verify. The possibilities were not just intriguing, they were extraordinary. "Thank you, sir," Elizabeth said, her natural politeness shining through despite her exhaustion and grief. "You're very kind to take me in. I don't know what would have happened if your man hadn't found me." Jonathan's smile was warm and reassuring, masking thoughts that were anything but paternal. "Think nothing of it, my dear. It's our Christian duty to help those in need. And I suspect you and I are going to become very well acquainted indeed." That night, as Elizabeth slept in the guest room under the watchful eye of Martha, Jonathan met with Samuel Bigham in the estate's wine cellar, a location chosen specifically for its privacy, and the impossibility of their conversation being overheard. What passed between them in that dimly lit stone chamber would set in motion events of unimaginable consequence. The first inquiry letter Jonathan wrote was never sent. Instead, it joined a growing collection of secret documents locked away in his study. Documents that told a very different story than the one he presented to his neighbors and the local authorities. Through careful and methodical investigation, Jonathan learned that Elizabeth's parents, William and Margaret Hartwell, had indeed been traveling to meet relatives in the western counties when their fatal accident occurred. But these relatives lived in the remote mountains near the Kentucky border, in settlements so distant and isolated that communication was sporadic at best, often taking months to traverse the dangerous wilderness roads. More importantly, the Hartwells had been relative newcomers to Virginia, having moved from Maryland just 5 years prior to establish a small but prosperous shipping business in Norfolk. This meant their local connections were limited, their social. The circle was small, and their sudden disappearance would likely be attributed to the dangerous conditions of frontier travel rather than foul play. Within a month of the accident, Jonathan had crafted a masterful deception that showcased both his intelligence and his complete lack of moral constraints. He presented himself to the county clerk as Elizabeth's appointed guardian, bearing carefully forged documents that claimed her mysterious Uncle Thomas had died of fever in the Kentucky wilderness just weeks before her parents' carriage accident. The timing was perfect, tragic enough to evoke sympathy, recent enough to explain why no one had been notified, and distant enough to make verification impossible. As her only surviving connection to Virginia society, Jonathan had graciously agreed to raise the girl as his ward, a charitable act that enhanced his reputation as a Christian gentleman while serving his own purposes perfectly. The county clerk, overwhelmed with the administrative chaos left by the war and impressed by Jonathan's standing in the community, accepted the documents without question, officially appointing him as Elizabeth's legal guardian. The transition was gradual and carefully orchestrated. Elizabeth, traumatized by her loss and isolated at the remote plantation, gradually began to accept Jonathan as her protector and benefactor. He hired Miss Adelaide Fenwick, an educated spinster from Richmond, as her tutor, ensuring Elizabeth received an education appropriate to her station, while carefully controlling her exposure to the outside world. He ensured she was treated with kindness and respect by the household staff, provided her with beautiful clothing and books, and slowly began the process of molding her into something very specific to his needs. But Jonathan's plans required more than simple guardianship. In the winter of 1778, he made a trip to Richmond that would prove crucial to his ultimate design. There, in the elegant offices of his lawyer, Cornelius Vance, Jonathan executed a series of legal maneuvers that were breathtaking in their audacity and sophistication. Vance was a man who understood the value of discretion and the importance of asking no uncomfortable questions when dealing with clients of Jonathan's caliber. Short and precise, with thinning grey hair and the soft hands of a man who had never performed manual labor, he had built his practice on serving the complex legal needs of Virginia's elite. Police cars revolving like this man wasn't just raising an orphan, he was engineering the perfect crime. Jonathan Caldwell walked into his lawyer's office in Richmond with a plan so twisted and calculated it would shock even the most ruthless schemers of his time. Step 1. He had adoption papers drawn up, making young Elizabeth, his supposed ward, not only his legal daughter, but his future heir. On the surface, it looked like pure charity. A childless widower rescuing an orphan. But underneath? It was a move to secure absolute control of her life, and her fortune. Step 2, he commissioned something far darker. A marriage contract. But this wasn't any normal contract. It was written in vague, slippery language, no bride's name, no exact date, just a mysterious clause that would only make sense years later. To the outside world, it looked harmless. To Jonathan? It was the endgame. His lawyer, Cornelius Vance, didn't ask questions. He was paid too well. And in Virginia's world of property law and inheritance battles, strange contracts weren't uncommon. But this one? This one was designed to trap Elizabeth in a future she could never escape. The adoption papers went public. Everyone saw Jonathan as a hero. But the marriage contract? That stayed locked away in Vance's private files, hidden, waiting for the moment Jonathan was ready to strike. Meanwhile, Elizabeth grew up inside Millhaven like a bird in a golden cage. Every detail of her education was designed to shape her into something Jonathan could use. French, Latin, mathematics, yes. But also the art of running a plantation, the delicate etiquette of Virginia society, and the subtle skills expected of a mistress of the estate. She was being molded piece by piece, trained for a destiny she didn't even know existed. And the scariest part? She trusted him completely. Because to the outside world, Jonathan Caldwell wasn't a villain. He was a savior. But behind the polished smile and the Christian charity, he was preparing for a move that would change Elizabeth's life forever. And the clock was ticking. To outsiders, Jonathan Caldwell appeared every inch the devoted guardian. He invested in Elizabeth's education, social refinement, and training in the management of the vast estate. To the neighbors, it seemed natural that he was preparing her for a suitable marriage, perhaps to a younger son of a noble family, or a rising merchant eager for the Caldwell name. His efforts were praised as responsible, his affection for Elizabeth seen as touching, and his careful planning viewed as admirable foresight. But beneath the surface, there were other lessons. From her earliest years, Elizabeth was exposed to subtle conditioning, messages too complex for a child to fully grasp. Jonathan spoke often of family loyalty above all else, of sacred bonds beyond society's rules, and of biblical precedents for unusual family arrangements that served what he claimed were God's higher purposes. He filled her mind with stories of the *** patriarchs of old, men with multiple wives and tangled households, *** who ensured the survival of their bloodlines through hardship. He told her of the Caldwell ancestors who had died defending their land, who had sacrificed everything to preserve their legacy, and of the sacred duty each generation owed to both the past and the future. Gradually, almost without notice, Elizabeth became the centerpiece of this narrative. Jonathan told her she was not merely his adopted daughter, she was the key to preserving the Caldwell dynasty. She was intelligent enough to oversee business, beautiful enough to bring honor to the family, and loyal enough to sacrifice her personal desires for the sake of blood and legacy. By 1782, just 16 years old, Elizabeth had blossomed into a young woman of remarkable beauty and intellect. but she had been carefully isolated from young men her age, repeatedly reminded that her destiny was to serve the Caldwell legacy. Slowly, she began to see Jonathan not simply as her guardian, but as the center of her universe, the architect of her future. The final phase of Jonathan's plan began in the spring of 1784. With chilling calm, he informed Elizabeth that he had received a letter from a distant cousin, one that proposed a marriage to unite two branches of the Caldwell family. Elizabeth's first glimpse of her intended husband came in the form of an exquisite miniature portrait that Jonathan presented to her in his study on a warm April morning. The painting, set in an ornate gold frame and obviously the work of a skilled artist, depicted a man who bore a striking resemblance to Jonathan himself, the same strong jaw, the same piercing dark eyes, the same air of quiet authority that seemed to emanate even from the small painted image. "His name is Jonathan Caldwell," her adoptive father explained, his voice carefully neutral as he watched her examination of the portrait. "He's a cousin from the western counties, a man of good character and substantial means who has built quite a successful tobacco operation in the mountains. The marriage would unite our family holdings and ensure that Mill Haven estate remains intact for future generations." Elizabeth studied the portrait with growing confusion, noting details that seemed somehow familiar yet impossible. The man's clothing was expensive but slightly outdated, his pose formal in the manner of portraits painted a decade earlier. Most puzzling of all was the uncanny resemblance to Jonathan, so striking that they could have been brothers rather than merely cousins. "But his name is the same as yours, Papa," she said, using the affectionate term she had called him since childhood. "How can this be? I thought our family naming customs were more varied." Jonathan's explanation was both brilliant and horrifying in its calculated simplicity. The cousin, he explained, had been named for the same ancestor, a common practice in colonial families seeking to honor their forebears and maintain connections across generations. This Jonathan Caldwell had inherited land in the Shenandoah Valley and had built a successful tobacco operation there, but he lacked the social connections and cultural refinement that came with generations of established wealth and position in Richmond society. The marriage, Jonathan continued with the smooth persuasiveness of a practiced manipulator, would benefit both parties. The cousin would gain access to Virginia's aristocratic society and the business connections that came with the Caldwell name, while Elizabeth would help preserve the family estate and ensure that her own future was secure. More importantly, the union would keep the family wealth consolidated, rather than allowing it to be dispersed among distant relatives who might not share their commitment to preserving the Caldwell legacy. "But I would be leaving you," Elizabeth said, and Jonathan was pleased to detect the genuine distress in her voice. Over the years, he had carefully cultivated her emotional dependence, ensuring that the thought of separation would be not just uncomfortable, but nearly unthinkable. "Not leaving, my dear," Jonathan replied, his voice soft with paternal affection that masked deeper, darker currents of satisfaction. "Expanding our family. This union has been arranged with great care to ensure that you will never be far from those who love you most. In fact, the arrangement includes provisions for your new husband to spend considerable time here at Mill Haven, helping to manage the combined operations of both estates." The wedding preparations began immediately, but they were unlike any Elizabeth had witnessed during her occasional visits to neighboring plantations or her rare trips to Richmond society events. Rather than the grand public ceremony typical of Virginia plantation society, with its elaborate guest lists, weeks of festivities, and celebrations that might involve hundreds, this would be a private affair conducted at Mill Haven Estate, with only a small number of carefully selected witnesses. Jonathan explained this unusual arrangement as a necessity of both practical and social considerations. Many prominent families remained scattered by the recent conflict. Travel was still dangerous, and the groom's family had expressed a preference for a simple ceremony that would not interfere with the complex business negotiations tied to the marriage settlement. Additionally, the bride's orphan status made a large celebration inappropriate. It would be more seemly to conduct the ceremony with dignity and restraint, rather than indulge in elaborate festivities that might seem insensitive given her tragic background. As summer gave way to autumn, Elizabeth found herself increasingly troubled by aspects of the arrangement that didn't seem quite right. Despite her respect for Jonathan's judgment and her gratitude for his care, the wedding invitations, which she was not permitted to review to see personally, were allegedly sent to the groom's family and various distant Caldwell relatives, but no responses ever arrived at Mill Haven. When she asked to read the letters of acceptance or regret that should have been flooding in from invited guests, Jonathan explained that all correspondence was being handled through his lawyer in Richmond to avoid burdening her with unnecessary details. When she requested permission to correspond with her intended husband before the ceremony, a perfectly reasonable desire, Jonathan explained that the man was traveling on business throughout the Western Territories and preferred to maintain the traditional formality of limited contact before marriage. Such restraint, he assured her, was actually a mark of respect and serious intent rather than indifference. But the most disturbing moment came in September, when Cornelius Vance arrived at Mill Haven in a hired carriage loaded with leather portfolios and mahogany document cases. Elizabeth was asked to sign legal documents related to her inheritance rights, the marriage settlement, and the union of the Caldwell estates. When she tried to read them carefully, Jonathan and Vance quickly dismissed her concerns, assuring her that the legal language is far too complex for anyone without training. These are merely formalities required by Virginia law, Vance explained. Standard documents that establish your rights as both an heir to the Caldwell estate and as a bride entering into a marriage contract that involves substantial property considerations. One document in particular caught Elizabeth's eye, a property deed that seemed to transfer her inheritance rights away from her entirely. When she questioned this alarming detail, Jonathan's answer was smooth and rehearsed. He explained that upon her marriage, her legal status would shift from daughter to daughter-in-law, and the paperwork simply reflected this transition, while supposedly ensuring her inheritance remained intact. But Elizabeth was far more intelligent than Jonathan anticipated, and she noticed the cracks in his carefully constructed story. Elizabeth thought she was preparing for the biggest day of her life, but what she discovered would turn her wedding into a nightmare. She had been trained, almost conditioned, to trust Jonathan completely. He raised her, educated her, and made sure she believed he was the one person who always had her best interests at heart. But now, sign after sign proved something was terribly wrong. The legal documents she was forced to sign were filled with twisted, confusing language that made no sense. Every page seemed designed to trick her into silence. The timing? Suspicious. The explanations? Too smooth, too perfect, like rehearsed lies. And then it happened. On a freezing October night, everything unraveled. Unable to sleep, Elizabeth crept into Jonathan's study, thinking she'd only find a book of poetry. Instead, what she saw nearly stopped her heart. The room was dark except for 3 silver candelabras. The flames flickered across towering shelves of books and portraits that stared down with cold, watchful eyes. And in the middle of it all, Jonathan. Alone. Focused. Bent over a desk covered in carefully organized papers. But it wasn't the documents that froze her blood. It was the portrait of her so-called fiancé. And right next to it, a mirror. Jonathan wasn't reviewing business contracts. He was comparing his own face to the painted portrait, changing his expression, fixing his hair, practicing until his reflection matched the image exactly. That's W.H. The cousin she was supposed to marry never existed. The man in the portrait was Jonathan himself. Her entire future had been built on a lie so monstrous, she could barely admit it to herself. Jonathan hadn't arranged a marriage to keep her close, he had orchestrated an elaborate deception to claim her, body and soul. And now, Elizabeth knew she was trapped inside a game she might never escape. Elizabeth explained everything that had troubled her about the wedding arrangements. There was no cousin. There had never been a cousin. Jonathan intended to marry her himself, using a false identity to make the arrangement appear legitimate while maintaining the legal fiction of their father-daughter relationship. Over the following days, Elizabeth began her own investigation, using the skills of observation and analysis Jonathan himself had taught her. She searched through the household correspondence, seizing brief opportunities during lessons with Miss Fenwick or whispered conversations with Martha about wedding preparations. What she uncovered chilled her to the bone. There were no letters from any cousin named Jonathan Caldwell. Instead, there were communications from Cornelius Vance, letters stressing the need for absolute discretion regarding the unusual ceremony. She found bills from a Richmond portraitist for altering miniatures and payments to merchants for clothing and accessories, designed to disguise someone's appearance. The breakthrough came when Elizabeth discovered a locked drawer in Jonathan's study. While he was away in Richmond, she used a hairpin, just as she had once seen Martha repair household locks, and managed to pry it open. Inside, she found the evidence that shattered her world. The inquiry letters about her parents, never sent. The forged guardianship papers granting him control over her. The fabricated correspondence from the fictional cousin, expressing eagerness for marriage. And most damning of all, Jonathan's handwritten notes, meticulously describing his plans for their wedding night, and the years that would follow. But it was the marriage contract that revealed the full horror. Drafted in Vance's careful legal handwriting, it named Jonathan Caldwell of Millhaven Estate and Elizabeth Hartwell, legally adopted daughter of Jonathan Caldwell. No cousin. No disguise. The groom and the adoptive father were explicitly the same man. The realization struck Elizabeth like a wave of ice water. Her stomach churned, her hands shook, her breath caught in her throat. Sitting in Jonathan's chair, she read the truth. The nightmare was real. Documents that outlined her fate with businesslike precision. Every kindness he had shown her, every lesson he had taught, every moment of paternal affection had been calculated steps toward this ultimate violation. She had been groomed from childhood to become not just his heir, but his wife, a woman who would be both his daughter and his bride. This ensured his bloodline would continue, while his estate remained intact under his absolute control. The most terrifying part? The scheme's legal sophistication, and her complete helplessness within it. By adopting her first, Jonathan secured paternal authority and her inheritance rights. By marrying her afterward, he guaranteed control of the estate while making their children indisputable heirs to the Caldwell fortune. In post-revolutionary Virginia, where property was power and bloodlines were everything, this arrangement was disturbing, but not necessarily illegal. Even worse were Jonathan's long-term plans. He calculated that Elizabeth's youth and his own status would allow them to pass as a conventional couple away from Millhaven. The adoption papers would stay buried. The marriage certificate would stand unquestioned. Their children would grow up never knowing the truth. That night, Elizabeth lay awake, planning her escape. But by dawn, the horror struck her. She had nowhere to go. Jonathan had isolated her completely. No friends her age. No outside connections. No money or property. Even the very documents that trapped her made it seem like she was complicit. And then came the final blow. The wedding was scheduled for November 15th, just 3 weeks away. Jonathan's trap was nearly perfect. But fate twisted on November 3rd, when an unexpected visitor arrived at Millhaven like an answer to desperate prayers. Reverend Thomas, traveling minister. A stranger showed up at the gates of Millhaven, and in that moment, Elizabeth's entire world was about to change forever. This wasn't just any traveler. His name was Reverend Hartley, and his surname sent shockwaves through Elizabeth's chest. Could this man be the missing link to her real family, or was it another trap? Hartley was no ordinary guest. A weathered minister of 50, he'd spent his life racing across the backroads of Virginia, baptizing babies, marrying couples, and burying the dead. He wasn't rich, but he carried something far more valuable, a lifetime of knowledge about Virginia's families, including the secrets no one dared write down. That night, in a dining room lined with portraits of Jonathan Caldwell's ancestors glaring down from the walls, Elizabeth sat frozen as Hartley told stories of lonely plantations, dangerous frontiers, and desperate families scattered across the wilderness. Every word tightened the knot in her stomach. She wasn't just listening. She was searching for the truth about herself. Then, the chance came. Jonathan stepped away, leaving her face to face with the only man who might know who she really was. Elizabeth seized the moment. Her voice trembled, but she forced the words out. Hartwell. Do you know the Hartwell family? What Hartley said next nearly broke her. Yes. William and Margaret Hartwell. A tragic loss. Carriage accident, years ago. But they were good people. They often spoke of their daughter, Elizabeth. A bright girl, heading west to live with Margaret's brother. In Kentucky. Her heart pounded. This was her. This was proof Jonathan had lied. But the bombshell wasn't over. Not an uncle. A brother. Thomas Whitfield. Alive. Still running a trading post near Harrodsburg. Still waiting. Still searching. Elizabeth could barely breathe. For years, Jonathan had told her there was no family, no proof, no hope. And now, in an instant, everything was different. But before she could speak, before she could claim her truth, Hartley's words cut through the air. He's worried about them, you know. They never arrived for their meeting. Tell me, child, why do you ask? Elizabeth's world was spinning. And in the next room, Jonathan's footsteps were already returning. She had just uncovered a truth so shocking it nearly destroyed her. Jonathan had lied for years. The uncle he swore was dead, was alive. And not only alive, but searching for her. For the first time in 13 years, Elizabeth realized she had real family, and Jonathan's empire of lies was about to collapse. But she was running out of time. The wedding, her own forced wedding, was only days away. And if she didn't act now, she'd be trapped forever. That night, Elizabeth made the most dangerous decision of her life. She wouldn't beg. She wouldn't hide. She was going straight into the monster's lair to gather proof of his crimes, and expose him to the only ally she had, Reverend Hartley. If she failed, she wouldn't just lose her freedom, she might lose her life. The mansion was silent as she crept through its shadowy halls. Every step could wake someone. Every creak of the floor could bring Jonathan storming out of the darkness. Finally, she reached his study. And what she saw inside was worse than her nightmares. Laid out on his desk were the final plans for their wedding, forged documents. Signatures in fresh ink, a blueprint of betrayal as precise as a military campaign. Jonathan wasn't just preparing a ceremony. He was preparing her prison. Then, he looked up. Their eyes locked. And in that single second, Elizabeth knew she was face to face with a man capable of murder. His calm voice was more terrifying than a shout. You should be sleeping. Tomorrow, we prepare for our wedding. The way he said our felt like a blade pressed against her skin. But Elizabeth didn't back down. Fear burned inside her chest, but so did defiance. There is no cousin, she said. Her words cut through the silence like glass shattering. There never was. You want me, for yourself. Jonathan's mask shattered instantly. Gone was the fake fatherly affection. What stood before her now was the predator he had always been, fully unmasked. His cold smile revealed one horrifying truth: he wasn't panicking. He was still confident he could win. And then he rose from his chair, slowly, deliberately, like a predator preparing to strike. What happened next would decide everything. Jonathan rose from his chair, and instantly the room felt smaller. His shadow stretched across the walls like a predator closing in on its prey. Elizabeth froze. She knew she couldn't fight him physically. He towered over her, and he knew it. Then he dropped the bomb. Yes, there is no cousin. And in 12 days, you will be my wife. You'll remain my daughter, my heir, and the mother of the children who will carry on my name. Elizabeth's blood turned to ice. This wasn't just obsession. This was a prison sentence for life. But instead of breaking, she shocked even herself. She pushed back. Everyone's interests but mine. For the first time, Jonathan's mask slipped into something even darker, a smile so cold it looked carved from stone. Your interests are my interests, Elizabeth. They always have been. Since the night I found you, on that lonely road outside Richmond. Do you think that was an accident? Do you think I raised you out of kindness? No. I orchestrated everything. Her heart stopped. His words confirmed the unthinkable suspicions she had buried for years. The carriage accident, she whispered. And with the casual cruelty of a man discussing the weather, Jonathan admitted the truth. I arranged it. Your parents carried a fortune for land in Kentucky. My men were ordered to retrieve the money. You were the unexpected bonus. But when I saw how much you resembled my dear Catherine, I knew Providence had given me something far more valuable than gold. Elizabeth's world collapsed in that moment. Her parents weren't victims of a tragic accident. They had been murdered. She hadn't been rescued. She had been stolen. Groomed. Trapped. Every memory of her life for 13 years was built on blood, lies, and a plan so twisted it defied belief. Desperate, she fired back the only weapon she had, hope in the law. The law will never permit this. Jonathan's response was a dagger of pure truth. He laughed. Not kindly. Not nervously. But with the full power of a man who owned the system. His voice echoed off the shelves of legal books and portraits like a gavel sealing her fate. The law? The law is whatever men like me say it is. On paper, you are legally my daughter. That gives me absolute authority. Soon, you'll be legally my wife. That means my authority never ends. The papers are signed. Witnessed. Filed in court. It's done. No judge, no lawyer, no minister will save you. In that instant, Elizabeth realized the horrifying truth: she wasn't just fighting Jonathan. She was fighting an entire system built to protect men like him. And Jonathan knew it. Virginia or anywhere else that can touch us. He moved closer as he spoke, and Elizabeth could smell the brandy on his breath, could see the cold satisfaction in his eyes as he contemplated his complete victory over her will and her future. He thought she was powerless, but her silence carried the one weapon that could destroy him. More importantly, my dear, you have nowhere to go and no one to help you. Your precious Uncle Thomas believes you died with your parents 13 years ago. You have no friends, no money, no connections to anyone who might assist you. Even if you could somehow escape Mill Haven, you would be a penniless orphan with no proof of your identity and no way to survive. Imagine being declared dead for 13 years, only to learn the truth from the very man who murdered your parents. But Jonathan had underestimated one crucial factor. Elizabeth's desperation had been matched by 13 years of education and careful observation. She had learned not just literature and mathematics, but the art of reading people, understanding motivations, and recognizing weaknesses, and she had identified Jonathan's greatest vulnerability, his overwhelming pride in his own cleverness. "You're right," she said quietly, allowing defeat to creep into her voice. "I have no choice but to accept what you've planned. But I need to understand something before I resign myself to this fate. How did you know my parents would be traveling that road with so much money? How did you arrange such a perfect ambush?" One question. That's all it took for the predator to trap himself in his own words. Jonathan's expression shifted to one of satisfied pride, as he recognized what he thought was her capitulation. Like many intelligent criminals, he could not resist the opportunity to explain the brilliance of his scheme to someone who could appreciate its complexity. "Your father was a fool," he said, settling back into his chair with the air of a man enjoying the chance to boast of his achievements. He advertised his business dealings far too openly, spoke too freely in Norfolk taverns about his plans to purchase land in Kentucky. It was simple enough to learn the details of his journey, the route he planned to take, and the fact that he would be carrying enough gold to complete the purchase. His arrogance made him talk. Her silence would make him fall. As Jonathan continued his explanation detailing the months of planning that had gone into her parents' murder and her own kidnapping, Elizabeth carefully memorized every word. She had no weapon, no way to overpower him physically. But she had something potentially more powerful, a witness sleeping upstairs who carried the moral authority of the church and the legal standing to be believed by magistrates and courts. And so, with nothing but words, Elizabeth set the stage for the downfall of a man who believed no law could touch him. What happened next became the subject of whispered speculation throughout Henrico County for decades afterward. A story that combined elements of justice, revenge, and divine providence in ways that defied easy explanation. The date and symbolism, November 15, 1789. You set the stage with precision, a wedding day, but instead of being a celebration of love, it's the culmination of Jonathan's monstrous plan. 1789 is also symbolically powerful. It's the year of revolution in France. Even though this story is set in Virginia, the world was changing. That revolutionary energy parallels Elizabeth's uprising against Jonathan's tyranny. Elizabeth's transformation. For 13 years, Jonathan thought he was training her into submission. But those very lessons became her weapons. Instead of passive victimhood, she flips her role and becomes the strategist, the manipulator, and ultimately the avenger. Her 12 days of preparation echo biblical epic patterns, like Christ's 40 days, or Macbeth's witches' cycles, a deliberate countdown to judgment. The evidence. You brilliantly catalogued the smoking guns, forged papers, fake cousin letters, bribes, financial ledgers, and Jonathan's twisted long-term plans. What makes this compelling is that Elizabeth doesn't just rely on emotions or accusations, she builds an airtight legal case. This elevates her from a victim into an architect of justice. The flaw in just evidence. You perfectly capture why documents alone wouldn't work. Jonathan's wealth, influence, and social connections made him untouchable in private. Elizabeth's insight is genius. She knows she must weaponize public spectacle. By forcing his crimes into the open, in front of magistrates and landowners, she creates a trap Jonathan can't escape. The stage of the Great Hall. This is cinematic, the Great Hall as both wedding venue and courtroom of judgment. Every important figure in the region is present: planters, magistrates, clergy, and society elites. They think they're attending a slightly unusual wedding, but Elizabeth is about to ambush them with truth. The bridal imagery. Her wearing Jonathan's first wife's dress is chilling and symbolic. It's not just a gown, it's a shroud of the dead woman he once controlled, altered to fit his new victim. Elizabeth, showing up pale but composed, reflects inner strength. She's walking into battle dressed as a bride, but wielding truth as her sword. This wedding was supposed to seal a fortune, but instead, it exploded into a nightmare. Catherine stood in pearls from her wedding day, arranged in the elaborate style favored by Virginia's high society. To the crowd, she looked like any bride, beautiful, trembling, perhaps overwhelmed by duty. But in truth, the ceremony they were about to witness was a mask for something sinister. Beside her stood Jonathan, dressed in midnight blue, his posture radiating pride and control. This wasn't about love. This was about power, securing his estate, continuing his bloodline, and cementing his standing. He was about to claim everything he wanted, at the cost of morality and at the cost of blood. Reverend Peaton, an old minister with decades of service, began the ceremony. His voice, heavy with authority, filled the hall with sacred words about duty, blessing, and holy union. Guests relaxed, lulled by ritual. To them, this was nothing unusual, another wealthy plantation wedding, bound by tradition and practicality. Then came the pivotal question: if any man can show just cause why these two may not lawfully be joined, let him speak now, or forever hold his peace. And in that instant, the entire illusion shattered. Elizabeth's voice cut the silence like a knife. I must confess a deception before God and these witnesses. I am not Elizabeth Caldwell. I am Elizabeth Hartwell. And this man murdered my parents, stole their gold, and kidnapped me for this very moment. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Chaos erupted. Jonathan tried to dismiss her words as hysteria, a bride's nerves gone wild. But it was too late. The truth was out, spoken in the one place he could never silence it. Elizabeth just pulled off the most shocking courtroom takedown in history, and nobody saw it coming. She stepped forward, calm as a soldier, and dropped a stack of stolen documents right in front of Reverend Peaton and the witnesses. These weren't just papers, they were Jonathan's entire life of crimes, exposed. The room froze. One by one, the men flipped through the evidence. Forged adoption papers. Faked signatures. Secret payments to hired killers. And worst of all, Jonathan's own handwritten notes, revealing how he had groomed Elizabeth from childhood for the most twisted betrayal imaginable. But Elizabeth wasn't finished. She had been saving the deadliest card for last. There is one more crime you must know about, she said, her voice steady, cutting the silence like a blade. Jonathan's secret: his first wife Catherine hadn't died in childbirth. Elizabeth had discovered her hidden diary and letters from a doctor describing arsenic poisoning. Jonathan had poisoned his own wife when she tried to expose his affairs. The revelation was nuclear. Magistrates in the room, actual judges, instantly realized the evidence was airtight. No amount of money or power could save him now. Jonathan Caldwell, once untouchable, was dragged away in chains. His trial would soon become the most sensational scandal in Virginia's early history. This trial was so shocking, it made headlines from Boston to Philadelphia, and exposed one of the darkest secrets in American history. The courtroom was electric. Jonathan Caldwell, the wealthy, respected gentleman, was now cornered. His defense? He screamed that Elizabeth was insane, that the documents were forged, and that jealous servants had framed him. But the walls of lies collapsed fast. Elizabeth stood like steel. Calm. Focused. Every word from her carried proof. She had documents, letters, records. The jury saw it. The witnesses saw it. Even Jonathan's powerful friends, the elite of Virginia, turned their backs. No one could protect him now. The prosecutors hammered the truth: this wasn't just fraud. This wasn't just greed. This man had murdered 3 people for money, kidnapped a child, and groomed her for 13 years, while hiding behind the mask of Christian respectability. The entire country was stunned. Newspapers called it one of the most evil scandals ever seen in Virginia. It became a symbol of how unchecked power could destroy lives, and why society had to defend the vulnerable at all costs. The verdict was brutal: guilty of first-degree murder for William and Margaret Hartwell. Guilty of kidnapping and false imprisonment. Guilty of fraud. Guilty of murdering his wife, Catherine. The punishment? Death by hanging. And on March 15, 1790, Jonathan Caldwell was executed before thousands in Richmond. The same people who once fought for an invitation to his lavish estate now watched him meet his end. But the story didn't stop there. Elizabeth, now the legal heir to everything Jonathan once owned, refused to let tragedy define her. Instead, she launched a mission. With federal marshals by her side, she traveled for months across dangerous territory to track down her lost uncle, Thomas Whitfield, in Kentucky. And when she finally found him, still clinging to hope after all those years, the reunion was overwhelming. Tears. Relief. Joy. But also scars that time could never heal. Elizabeth had endured 13 years of psychological torture and escaped a fate worse than death. It changed her forever. She now understood evil better than most people ever would, and she dedicated her life to making sure no other child suffered like she had. Despite her beauty, wealth, and intelligence, Elizabeth never married. Too many men tried. Too many offered riches and promises. But after what she survived, she knew the cost of misplaced trust. Her life became a warning, and a legacy. That even the most powerful man can fall, and even the most broken survivor can rise. She had escaped a nightmare most women never survived, and instead of seeking comfort, she built an empire of hope. Refusing to ever live under a man's legal authority again, Elizabeth poured her fortune into schools for orphans across Kentucky and Virginia. These weren't just classrooms, they were fortresses of protection, where vulnerable children could finally be safe from predators hiding behind false kindness. Her institutions became models for the nation, demanding not just education, but laws that verified every hand that dared claim a child's future. In time, her work reshaped American child welfare, protecting countless innocents for generations. When Elizabeth died in 1847 at the age of 81, she wasn't alone. She was surrounded by the very children she had saved, hundreds who owed their lives to her defiance of evil. Governors, senators, and powerful figures crowded her funeral, honoring a woman who had turned personal tragedy into national transformation. But Mill Haven, the estate where blood had been spilled, never healed. The mansion was sold to pay debts and reparations, then left to rot until it was finally demolished. Locals whispered that the land itself was cursed, crops withered, animals refused to graze, and for a century it lay barren, a scar etched into Virginia's soil. Today, hikers can still stumble upon the old stone foundations, unaware they are walking on ground that once hid unspeakable horrors. The Caldwell name, once towering in Virginia society, was erased within a generation. Relatives fled, changed names, or vanished, unable to live under the shadow of Jonathan's monstrous crimes. It was proof that no dynasty, no matter how rich or respected, can survive the weight of truth. Justice did not end with Jonathan's execution. His overseer, Samuel Bigham, was tried and hanged for his role in the murders. Cornelius Vance, the cunning lawyer who twisted laws to shield evil, lost his license and fled, but even he was hunted down, imprisoned for fraud and conspiracy. This wasn't just a trial. It was a war for truth, and one girl's courage blew apart the most powerful man in Virginia. For years, Jonathan Caldwell hid behind wealth, religion, and respectability. He looked untouchable. But Elizabeth Hartwell ripped the mask off, and what she revealed shook America. The courtroom exploded when the evidence hit the table: forged adoption papers, blood money to hired killers, and letters that proved Jonathan had murdered Elizabeth's parents to steal their gold. And then came the twist no one saw coming: he had poisoned his own wife, Catherine, to keep his dark secrets buried. This case wasn't just big. It was legendary. Newspapers in Philadelphia and Boston screamed the headlines: a wealthy plantation master exposed as a murderer, kidnapper, and predator. Even his allies abandoned him. And when the jury returned, the sentence was death by hanging. On March 15, 1790, before a roaring crowd in Richmond, Jonathan Caldwell's reign of terror ended at the gallows. But this wasn't just about punishment, it was about survival. Elizabeth, once a child prisoner groomed for destruction, now stood as the sole heir. And she didn't waste a single second. Instead of falling into despair, she launched a mission. With her inheritance, she built schools for orphans across Virginia and Kentucky, safe havens where children would never again be prey for monsters like Jonathan. She changed the law itself, forcing systems to protect orphans, vet guardians, and expose abusers. Her vision spread nationwide, shaping the way America defended its most vulnerable. Elizabeth never married. She refused to surrender her independence to any man after the nightmare she endured. But when she died at 81, she wasn't alone. Hundreds of children she had rescued stood by her side, proof that one act of courage can ripple across generations. Meanwhile, Mill Haven, Jonathan's cursed estate, was left to rot. Locals swore crops withered, animals refused to graze, and the land itself rejected life. Today, hikers stumble across broken stones in the forest, never knowing they are walking on ground soaked in blood and betrayal. Jonathan's name? Erased. His allies? Executed, imprisoned, disgraced. And his legacy? Nothing but a warning: no mask of respectability can hide evil forever. Elizabeth Hartwell's courage didn't just destroy one predator, it rewrote the rules of justice, protected thousands of children, and proved that even in the darkest times, one voice refusing silence can topple an empire of lies. So remember this: the most terrifying monsters wear the most civilized masks. And the greatest heroes are the ones who tear them off.